Welcome to Post-Doom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot, grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm Michael Dowd, your host. And in this conversation, recorded in July of 2020, I speak with Michael Garfield, a modern-day Renaissance man. This is a young man with a background in paleontology. He's also a visionary, a futurist. He's an incredible musician, as well as a visionary artist. In fact, his website, michaelgarfieldart.com, you can access most of his interesting stuff. He actually also works at the Santa Fe Institute. He's got a podcast on complexity there. He's going to be interviewing me for his other podcast, which is Future Fossils. And so I think you'll like this conversation. We went to a wide variety of places, and he also brings a knowledge of technology and emergence in complex systems. Here it goes. Just to help the viewer or the listener get who you are.
Sure. Well, I currently, how do we want to do this? Like a paleontologist, you dig down from the top. I currently work by day at the Santa Fe Institute on communications staff, where I drink from the fire hose of systems science on a daily basis, and I encode that information in the form of our social media and the form of Complexity podcast for a general audience, as well as, scientists and science adjacent investors and, the various policymakers and practitioners that are, interested in, thinking about functional relationships and emergent properties and so on. By night, and the work that got me into this job, I work as the host of Future Fossils podcast, which was a sort of extension of my career as a public speaker on the festival circuit, which grew sort of awkwardly out of an academic background, an incompleted graduate program in evolutionary biology and the philosophy of science. And actually, that's how I know you, Michael. This is, I think, now 15 years in the making, because I first found out about you through our mutual affiliation with the Integral Institute and your appearances on the Integral Naked podcast. And I remain in regular correspondence with Stuart Davis and worked under Sean Hargens at JFKU studying integral ecology. So that's where I am. 13 years as a professional musician and performing visual artist, and now those things are sidelined as a parent. But that's sort of I live at the intersection of art and science and philosophy and spiritual practice, and that's where I am.
That's great. That's very helpful. In fact, a question that I haven't asked others, but it seems completely relevant to ask you right here at the start on this is, I normally ask about the language post-doom itself and just what language you tend to use in these contracting times. But you've got a young family, and I'm just curious, anything you want to say about the challenges, the joys and challenges, but especially the challenges of living in this coronavirus era where we're still sort of seeing what this is like, and then you've got part of a huge piece of your own legacy and your own passion, your own heart are doing things that normally require people to meet in buildings and stuff like that. So how is this for you?
Oh man, well, I have a friend here in town, Mark Nelson, who was one of the so-called biospherians that locked themselves inside the Biosphere 2 experiment in Oracle, Arizona for 2 years. He's written a number of books on the study of closed autonomous ecosystems and on wastewater gardening, and was responsible for planting an enormous fruit orchard here in the in the Santa Fe area and tending that. He's a real gentle, sweet guy. And when I had him on Future Fossils, he said that that hope, or he said rather, optimism is a yoga, and that there are, you can regard this as somewhat cynical, but there are good reasons to believe that it's simply good for your health to be optimistic. and to practice that optimism. And I think for me, as someone who learned a good deal of helplessness in my 20s, coming out of the university system, truly, truly dejected that I was not given any opportunities to pursue really deep and interesting questions, and decided to go off and make a career as an independent, right at the moment of economic collapse here
Yeah.
in on Earth, um, and was introduced very kind of rudely to the reality that the world I had grown up expecting as normal was really a sort of narrow window of opportunity for for a handful of generations, and really
Yes.
not even the whole generation, really very specific subsets of
Yes.
the human race, um, that I've had to adjust my expectations a lot as an adult about what it means to live and thrive. And here I am in this job having the most stability and security that I've ever had in my life.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
you know, practicing, on a team in what I regard as a sort of monastery of science that is like
It is.
many
Yeah.
monasteries through history,
Yes.
insulated from the worst effects of this pandemic.
Yes.
Although
Yes.
there's adjustment to be made. Um, and the social unrest. Santa Fe is very unique in its demographic constitution, and so we do have a lot of enduring perennial issues with relationships with indigenous peoples, and the Spanish colonial presence and so on. But um, what we have not had are bloody, violent riots. It's that
Yes.
we've so I don't know. It's tricky because I think that I really regard my I am very careful in general. I think that I have never really considered it possible for me to have the stability, for example, of a homeowner in my adult life, and I'm just now beginning to consider that as a possibility. So I'm in a position where I'm, for the first time in my life, I have the stability to consider you know possibly buying a home and raising my family in a place and not moving every year. And
Hmm.
I mean, I was with my partner for 15 years before we had a kid because things were just so turbulent.
Hmm.
um, and and so right now I'm really living this tension between, do is it safe to settle down here, or are we better off just buying an RV, and like being ready to move at any given time, But I think that, and we can get into this later, I think I've had a lot of really good conversations over the last few years about the sort of mutually exclusive neurological action, like activation of fear and curiosity. And I think that when it comes to trauma, which is something that is increasingly ubiquitous, and actually very much probably a defining characteristic of human beings, our painful self-awareness and the trauma that comes with our our conscious minds. Um,
Yeah, I actually don't think, let me just jump in
yeah,
real quick because I don't think it's a human species thing. I think it's a cultural thing in that one of the things I've studied over the last 7 years is the difference between more or less sustainable cultures, those that can live in place without destroying the place, indigenous first peoples, tribal hunter-gatherers, and civilized cultures. And there seems to be a huge difference in terms of our basic human needs being met and our joy in life. And so I think that it's probably more a symptom of civilization, city-based, human-centered, anthropocentric civilization. And it's much less common and hardly found in ecocentric, life-centered, smaller scale horticultural or hunter-gatherer societies.
certainly. I think Christopher Ryan, who just wrote Civilized to Death,
Yeah.
makes a good point that mental health looks very different among foraging societies. That leisure and that there's just a lot more sort of uh, lubrication for
Yeah.
the brain in certain ways. But I will say that, like, when I just interviewed Lawrence Gonzalez for SFI's podcast, he wrote a number of books about survival and the surviving survival. And, he was looking at these ancient archaeological, or rather, kind of paleontologically old human settlements, and a couple hundred people left a pile of 1 million stone knives. And it's like, well, what were they doing? And he talks about how goal directed, repetitive, detail oriented behavior is the way that it seems that the brain learns to deal with trauma by interfering with the activity of what neuroscientists call the rage pathway. And that, the anxiety of our, I think there's a way to have a both and here with what you just said. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what you're saying reminds me, Paul Shepard famously remarked that there's a certain collective psychosis that's common to settled city-based civilizations. And that then expresses or exhibits itself as kind of like, once domestication, just the very process of domestication tends to do things mentally as well as physically to whatever beings are being domesticated, even if that's ourselves. Anything you'd like to say about your trajectory, your worldview, your story, and how it evolved, and were there any significant episodes or people or books or things that were turning points in bringing you to where you are now?
Yeah, to speak to the turd in the punch bowl, I actually think that the integral movement generated more black sheep than it did, anything else. I certainly found myself on the margins of that while living in the center of it for a while, and I think that part of that is because there is optimism as a yoga, and then uh, the performance of optimism as a way of coping with a deep and unaddressed insecurity. And I think that modernity really is at its very heart deeply insecure, and rightly so. And so, at any rate, in my own life, I was, I grew up completely committed to the path of paleontology, from like the age of 3. And a lot of people say, I was into dinosaurs or whatever, but no, I met my childhood role model, Robert Bacher, who was the author of Dinosaur Heresies. He was a huge piece of changing the public perception of dinosaurs from, cold-blooded, sluggish reptiles to warm-blooded, potentially feathered, parental care giving and animals rather than monsters that had a
Yes.
very rich ancient environment that they were living in, and really, he's such an interesting character. He
Who is
not
he?
only
What's his name?
Robert Bacher, R.T. Bacher. Um,
Okay.
he not only, he was a principal consultant on films like Jurassic Park and so on, but if you look at his educational background, he not only was it like a Yale and Harvard graduate teaching anatomy at Johns Hopkins, he was also teaching the Talmud in its original Hebrew, and was a very when I started working with him in the field in Wyoming in the summers as a 12-year-old, which I did throughout my teenage years. I think I regard him as potentially even more of a significant figure in my childhood than my own father. And he really impressed upon me a sense of paleontological fieldwork as a modern continuance of desert mysticism. And he looks
Wow,
like
I
a
love it.
biblical patriarch. He has this enormous beard and this like screwy eye, and the long eyebrows, and was wore a fat vest full of stuff, and the hat, the wide brim hat, and would quote the Talmud out there and would say, it was ex nihilo was a mistranslation. There was never nothing. It was formlessness in the original Hebrew, and so we would be out there in the wilderness, and I realized immediately at the age of 12. And my mother was very much a sort of American romantic, in the sort of Emerson and Thoreau tradition.
Hmm.
Really
Hmm.
spent a lot of time with me outdoors. Loved, creek crawling and rock picking, and so
Hmm.
it was a delight for her to bring me out to these things. And I realized very quickly that I felt more at home outdoors than I
Yeah.
did indoors. And also that I felt much more at home communing with deep time than I did with my gaze locked at street level in a school desk. And I was very lucky for a long time. For several years I was in a very uh, you know kind of a pilot educational program in grade school where I was able to remain with the same cohort of students and the same excellent teacher who was teaching us Greek and Latin root words. And I was blessed in that regard to not be
Yeah.
subject until middle school to the kind of system that has been critiqued by people like John Taylor Gatto. That's like the factory assembly line for education. But nonetheless, it was like around the same time that I started going out to Wyoming and realizing that I identify more as a wild animal. That I believe that we have erected in some respects a false boundary between what it is to be human and what it is to be wild, and that the walls that we have created around the city and the stories, the fear that the ancient Greeks and people like them experienced in their considerations of the wilderness, that this is a place of gods and danger, um, that that there is some truth to that. But again, it is part of this sort of encapsulation and walling off of the vast majority of what we are in order to kind of compress things so that they are efficient and expedient within the sort of informational and thermodynamic demands of city life. And so it's like,
Hmm.
you've got people like Hakeem Bey, who, the first year I was out at Burning Man, I read his book Temporary Autonomous Zone, which was a huge text in the inspiration of the Burning Man festival, which says, basically the empire was never founded. That chaos, he talked about ontological chaos and this notion that we continue to live um, in, the city is kind of like a cell that ejects its waste, and then in our
Yeah.
case, the waste is this inconvenient idea that we share our cities with kestrels and wild dandelions and rats. I read somewhere that there are you're never more than 16 feet from a rat in New York City, something like that. So, I mean, I think that like a big one of the things when you talk about the how this reflects on the coronavirus situation. One of the essays that was written recently for the Santa Fe Institute's transmission series on the pandemic by UCLA professor Pamela Yeh was about she studies urban songbird populations, and and she was talking about how this pandemic has given us a really amazing, unprecedented opportunity to study the behavior and evolution of urban non-human wildlife,
Yes.
and that uh, we're seeing the ways that there are cases, and I think to allude to what you mentioned earlier, this is other SFI work by Stephanie Crabtree, who studied the Martu people of northern Australia, and how when they were they hunted by controlled burns, and that those controlled burns created all of these sort of uh, like a micro system in which animals were able to come in, and the biodiversity of those burn areas was much greater than the areas around it. And so when the British came and kicked them all off of their land, the biodiversity in the the ancestral homes of the Martu completely crashed, and now 50 years later they're being reintroduced, and they're being able to resuscitate those areas. And that similar work has shown that in certain urban environments or certain parts of a city, that the city actually supports biodiversity. And so it's, I think we have to be really careful about our narratives here, because and we can get to the sort of, the doomier piece of this, because there is I think a good reason to to address uh, from the position of physics and the second law of thermodynamics, the fact that we're sort of trapped in a ratcheting, what SFI distinguished Professor Jeffrey West calls a finite time singularity, where our crisis innovation cycle is always accelerating, and we have to innovate our way out of disaster. But by doing so, we have wound the clock even faster, and cities as social reactors that bring people together and create social platforms for innovation are in a way kind of mathematically congruent with an actual physical singularity, where it's like we can't escape the gravity of this influence,
Right.
because it's wealth generating, but it's also disease and crime generating, and it's also ecocidal. And so at any rate, this is, my history, I think, has been shaped. One more point on this is that, you cannot study prehistory without being basically a student of death and collapse. And,
Yes, exactly.
the mass extinctions. I think, a huge piece of the allure of dinosaurs is the mystery of their extinction, which it is still a mystery, even though we've got all this evidence from meteor now. It's like, does the meteor's impact actually align with the pattern of marine extinctions that we see at the same time? Like they're all, there were
Yeah.
all the complexity of like the concurrent 2 million year volcanic eruptions that were going on, the land bridges that were being formed between continents, and the transfer of disease from one area to another. At any rate, so you get into this way of seeing as a paleontologist that acknowledges that our particular doom is not unprecedented. And I think a big piece of my work as an essayist and public speaker has been to sort of help people make sense of the situation that we're in by drawing analogies to prior mass extinctions, such as the Great Oxidation Event of 2 billion years ago, where
That's quite a ways back. I'm curious,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
what? Yeah.
Well, this one in particular I think is really useful, and then I'll cut this rant. But like this particular event was, this was a time when there was no complex life on the surface of the planet. Just only single-celled organisms, and then fairly early on, about 3 billion years ago, cyanobacteria evolved photosynthesis, which creates oxygen as a waste product. And at the time, no organism had a way of metabolizing oxygen. It was poison. It causes everything to rust, right? And so as oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere over 1 billion years, eventually it started leading to mass die-offs, because all of the anaerobic organisms that live in the soils in our guts now were once surface-dwelling organisms and could be, and suddenly they could not be. And the response to that that mass die-off was the modern oxygen-based glycolytic metabolism that basically all animals possess. And so the delicate balance that we kind of consider this, we think of this as having always been here, that we exhale what the trees inhale and vice versa, but that was not always the case. And it was, I think there's good reason to look at that as sort of the prototypical atmospheric industrial pollution event, and the sort of prototypical closure of manufacturing cycles that we would be wise to learn from and implement now, and like, think about how we close all the loops of our industrial and informational waste products as as an instance of like, how do we move forward um, in a sustainable way. So like, when people talk about the city engendering collapse at the planet scale, I think that's because I'm sort of disappointed that the conversation has really settled on this dichotomy between open-ended infinite growth outward in order to sustain itself and total collapse. And there's this enormous area in between those two things. One is that the rainforest is constantly growing, but it's growing into its own death. And then one is that, like, when you look at the history of civilizational collapse, like, yeah, Rome collapsed, the Chaco Canyon society collapsed, but those places are, those people, their descendants are still there. It fragmented, it balkanized, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was the end of an era, and I think,
Yeah, it wasn't.
yeah,
Yeah, I like that the Dark
yeah,
Mountain Project has a line toward the end. Paul Kingsnorth and Dugald Hine conclude, not exactly the concluding sentence, but close to it, that the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop. Anybody who's got a future fossils podcast, that's pretty cool. So say something about that.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that you kind of just spoke to it. I think, there's part of me reflects on this notion that there are more people alive studying like Çatalhöyük or Athens than were actually living in those cities at when they were at their prime,
Oh, that's
and
I'm going to steal that line. That's really great.
and so this question of like the Long Now Foundation has written a lot
Mm-hmm.
about this. Stuart Brand and Kevin Kelly have spoken to this question of the insecurity of digital data formats for the recording of our history, and how they're obviously both very techno optimistic in a way that makes me uncomfortable, frankly.
Yeah.
um, and I think that there's a certain amount of you know psychological self-justification maybe going on with
Mm-hmm.
people who have been sort of exalted by the technological progress of the last 50, 70 years.
Yeah.
That said, high praise to Stewart for the Whole Earth catalog, and
Yeah.
giving us helping ensure that we have declassified those first images of Earth from space, and the impacts that those projects made on the burgeoning environmental movement and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this idea that we live in what will be regarded by the future as a kind of dark age, an era where, like all other periods in history, the data is frustratingly sparse, and so I and many of my friends feel a kind of ethical obligation to archive, to create a robust record of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And there are interesting questions about the construction of a modern or postmodern personhood, with the digital simulacrum that all of us create through our lives online. I have an essay on Medium called "The Future Acts Like You," where we talk about the evolution as an algorithm exploring the search space for maximum entropy. So you like the river going down the mountain, and like it forms all the tributaries of the lightning bolt where the electrons take every possible pathway from the air to the ground. And so this question of you can look at it in religious history as like the splitting of sects, the sort of bifurcation of an original religious lineage into all of these sort of different interpretations of its own history.
Mm-hmm.
Or I was just talking about how like the United States looks like it's going to take a play out of the Bitcoin playbook and hard fork here in a minute, as like we polarize to the degree that people have completely incompatible ideas about what the United States is and what the Constitution
Mm-hmm.
says. And this is natural. Like, this is a part of the evolutionary process of like speciation.
Hmm.
Exploring. You take that side and I'll take that side, and we'll see who gets there first. That's a very
Exactly.
natural thing to happen. But so what that means is, I think, that I think about this in terms of um, exploring all of the different ideas that we're carrying as a civilization with an eye to the fact that we are participants in this sort of deep time play of emergence. And this process where maybe if we're lucky, uh, we're going to leave meaningful records for a future to make sense of things, so that so that we are not forcing them into a condition where they have to repeat all of our mistakes. And like Bjork has a beautiful song on her album Utopia about that. Like, I just want you to have different problems than we have. you know and so part of it is like living in light of that future that is watching us, that from a kind of indigenous medicine tradition perspective. Those There are the ancestors that are present with us
Hmm.
now, and our descendants are also present
Yeah.
with us now. And so what does it mean to live uh, in the longest now that we can, to step out and think about these things in terms of great galactic scale time cycles. And then the other part is just being a good ancestor. Um, and and then the third part, which I think speaks to the very beginning of our conversation, we were talking about trauma, is one. I think we are. There's a sense in which, like, Marshall McLuhan talks about uh, the revival of old ways, um, as a new medium exhumes that which was buried by the previous medium. And that the internet, a lot of people have spoken very eloquently about this. Eric Davis, in his book Technosis, is a great example. I love that book. He talks about the ways that pre-modern animism, in particular, he calls it reanimism, has
Hmm.
been triggered by the internet and by like smart homes, and the in the discarnate agents that live online, the bots, that the algorithms that now define our so many of our lives. That this world in function looks much more like the world of like ayahuasca shamanism than it looks like the world of Isaac Newton, or
Yes,
Albert
exactly.
Einstein. And so there is this circularity, or deep symmetry to time and to the unfolding of history. Although I got to, I history, it's like histories. Um, but this sort of like notion of future fossils is about, again, like us growing up into a world that is challenging the expectations that we grew up with in a way that is very atavistic, in many respects. And uh, and there are like certain traumas associated with that revelation that I regard, and with like Richard Doyle at Penn State University wrote this book Darwin's Pharmacy, where he talks about the possibility that language emerged as a way of coping with the radical reformations of subjectivity inherent to the psychedelic experience. And that that what he calls the ecodelic experience, which breaks the subject object divide and shows the self as the sort of still point at the center of colliding infinities, um, completely co-imbricated with our environments. That language emerged out of that, again, as this sort of like this passionate, desperate attempt to communicate the ineffable. And so I think like podcasting is kind of that, that like even your show is like, how do we deal with this? Like, how do we think about this? How do we make sense of the enormous and consequent things that we are living through? And for me, just the process of editing this podcast, or really the two that I host, both of them, is in a way kind of like the manual transcription of illuminated texts. Like it is a form of prayer, and like the through that goal directed, repetitive, and and uh, oral transmission piece of it. Also, I find that that podcasting has become, as Duncan Trussell said, kind of a sacrament, and
Yes.
a form of spiritual practice that is helping me help other people make sense of the insanity that we're living through, which really only looks insane because we have certain sort of inborn expectations of sane, right? Like it's supposed to, like straight lines aren't really sane, but that's a whole other thing,
Right.
you know.
But from an eco psychology, eco theological, basically from an ecological perspective, if sanity is thinking in right relationship or in alignment with reality, and insane is thinking that is not aligned with reality, then yeah, insanity is not a bad word for what we're experiencing now. Well,
Yeah.
say something about your other podcast.
Yeah, so Complexity Podcast for the Santa Fe Institute is a show where I get to interview world leading experts in complex systems science. And I've mentioned a number of them on this show already. Stu actually was another Future Fossils guest. He's formerly associated with SFI, and he's actually somebody who's brilliant, but I think perhaps a little too smart for his own good, because he has this notion that that evolution continues expanding into what he calls the adjacent possible, and like Kevin Kelly really latched onto this, and this notion that we're always going to be able to find a way out, because the scope of what we can touch, what we can reach from where we are, is constantly growing because the island is constantly growing. But I
Yeah,
think that
it's Stu and I
I'm
actually had a conversation around that. I haven't had that conversation with Kevin yet, but the big shift for me, I held that worldview from 2000 to 2012, actually December of 2012.
interesting.
I lost that. I let that go. It was ripped out of my hands actually by watching David Roberts' TED Talk called "Climate Change is Simple" in
Hmm.
December 3rd of 2012. And then I've spent 30 to 40 hours a week, 20 to 40 hours a week studying not just complexity and ecology, but especially the rise and fall of civilizations and energy. And there are actually natural constraints to that sense of ongoing possibility and expansion. But we don't need to go into there. It's the biggest influence on my life, if I was to say for myself, what was the biggest turning point more than anything else, it was really William Catton's book Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. I
Hmm.
consider it the most important book I've ever read. Many people consider it the most important book of the 20th century, and it gave the ecological here, a sociologist was the best articulator of the ecological paradigm. And I think that were Kevin Kelly or Stu Kaufman or others who have this sense of unending expansion to read that, or to acquaint themselves with like Walter Youngquist's Geodestinies, or people who get energy and the constraints of energy, I think they'd be a little less techno-utopian in that unidirectional sense.
Definitely. So, to speak to Complexity Podcast, we just recently had a 2-episode conversation with Jeffrey West, who used to be the president of SFI, I think after Stu Kaufman. And there's definitely been a sea change in the thinking at SFI around these things that's much more based in Jeffrey West's work with Jim Brown and Brian Enquist on scaling laws and thermodynamics and what that means for biological and urban systems. And so like there's a reason why there are as you just said, there are natural constraints to the size of human civilization on Earth, for the same reason that there are natural constraints to the body of a terrestrial mammal. And it has to do with these, the ability to distribute resources in a branching network,
Exactly.
on one hand, and then the ability of that system to acquire resources. And I think this is the missing piece from Stu's perspective, which is that, yeah, given a an IV from the cosmos, just like unending energy, then potentially we could continue growing indefinitely. And certainly, people like Buckminster Fuller have made a good point that the real poverty is a poverty of the imagination here. It's the ability to recognize the resources that we have, but at the same time, the resources are really affordances, and affordances of our environment are determined by our anatomical ability and cognitive and conceptual cultural ability to recognize them. And that ability to recognize resources is itself constrained by the lazy as possible tendency of evolution to be only as smart as you have to be. And so when the problems arrive at a time scale faster than we can evolve ourselves into them, then you end up running out of cliff, like Wile E. Coyote, right? It's like, in
Yes. Yeah.
theory you could run all the way around the planet, but you're running so fast you didn't have time to evolve wings. And so I mean that's where we are, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful conversation. Jeff West's, and then also the latest was with Lawrence Gonzalez, but then we also have others very early in the series. We had a two-parter with Jennifer Dunn, who's SFI's VP of Science, and her work on network ecology, looking at trophic, like food web networks, and how we learn that this underlying energetic structure is conserved throughout history because modern oceanic food webs actually look geometrically identical to food webs from 500 million years ago. And so the organisms are constantly evolving into these, it's not like Platonic idealism exactly, but it is a sort of more of like a Gaian biospheric
Yeah.
self-organization,
Yes,
and like creation of niches. And there's
exactly.
these niches, these are stable niches. So like a whale
Exactly.
is actually just a sort of reboot of this thing called Titanichthys, which was, a placoderm, which is a toothless, jawless fish that existed, like 400 or so million years, 300 or 400 million years ago. Was a baleen type filter feeding thing. And then there were probably large swimming reptiles that were doing the same thing. And so these, there's a continuity here that I think is really important for us to understand, and that I think, maybe if we're lucky to kind of like put a bow on this, my interest in the doom piece of this and the post-doom piece of this is very much about a soft landing. You know, does does the kind of reform we need for racial justice require that we burn down the police station, city hall, the hospital? Does the change that has to happen in order to secure a sustainable ecology on this planet, does it require a 90% reduction of human life, or does it just require a 90% reduction of the use of human beings of like electricity? Like, can we get by, like how, like we're gonna crash land this thing, the wheels are not coming down, but how, like, can we find a somewhere soft to land it? Can we land this at a low enough angle that we don't just smash the nose of the plane into the tail? And I think we can. And of course, I'm biased to believe that because I'm a new parent. But I think
Yes,
we
exactly.
can. And I think, I think that we have more wisdom at our disposal now. Your show is a living indication of this. That we have more people with more perspective, with more kinds of perspectives, more capable of sharing and collaborating than we've ever had. And
Hmm.
I think that there's great reason for hope in that we can do this in a way that is that honors the realistic constraints on both sides, that we can't just, in some sense, we can't just decide that we're going to collaborate on a global degrowth economy. Like, it's probably that's a collective action problem at a scale that we probably cannot handle. But like, there are smaller scales at which we can address collective action problems and reduce some of the damage that is going to come as a consequence of all this. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Just last night, Connie and I watched my post-Doom conversation that I had with Peter Russell, 5 months ago. And you use the Wile E. Coyote thing. He talks about how things are in this positive or self-reinforcing feedback, and it's faster. And that, yeah, it seems like it's out of our control. And so then the question becomes, how do we, whatever might still be in our control, whatever decisions we can make individually and especially collectively that could possibly soft land this sucker, how do we do that, and how do we do it at some sense of scale, so that at least in certain locales the collapse is less bad than in other places, which seems to be the case whenever empires or large scale systems collapse, contract and collapse. I mean, collapse is sort of the wrong metaphor because we think of it like off the cliff, and it's usually a stair step of collapse and a partial recovery, collapse, partial recovery. John Michael Greer wrote a book called The Long Descent, which is this catabolic collapse. But anyway, I love the fact that you went into all of it. So this is awesome. I already realized I could talk to you for another hour. How would you speak if you were offering in a relatively concise way, 5 minutes or less, sort of some wisdom that anybody who watching this or listening to this conversation of ours could apply to their lives or read or whatever that might be of support, of use, of helpfulness?
I think I've mentioned two of the books in this conversation already. One being Surviving Survival by Lawrence Gonzalez, which really addresses how do we get on with our lives after trauma. And that was a very profound and frankly a very difficult read for me, reading about people surviving murder suicides and bear attacks and IEDs in Iraq and this kind of thing. But I think ultimately very inspiring because he manages to show how so much of the best of our humanity emerges out of our response to these crises. That
Exactly.
that service. One of the big things about how you get on with your life after a traumatic event is you find people that are worse off than you and you help them.
Absolutely. I
And
regularly say that. I mean, there's nothing more important than finding somebody where you can be a blessing to them. You can be a contribution to them, because that's what helps us get out of depression, find meaning again, and find joy again.
definitely. Another one is Scale by Jeffrey West, because he really,
Mhm.
I think, lays it out in terms that are very difficult to argue or ignore.
Yeah.
Uh, just how we're in a very unsustainable position right now as a civilization, but two, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to unwind it. And I think that
Yeah.
that his characterization of the biophysical scaling laws and the properties of fractal networks and so on offer a sort of, he's kind of a doomer himself. He's not optimistic about this at all, but he also got into this work because he is admittedly more obsessed with his own mortality, and I think this was a way for him to sort of come to terms with his own eventual demise. And so he's not thinking about but at the same time, I think that book does sort of suggest design principles for a sustainable civilization, and
Yeah.
he gives less attention to biomimicry in urban design than I think is appropriate. But a lot of the people working with him, his co-authors like Luis Betancourt at the University of Chicago, are now looking at how do you apply this in a way to improve the human quality of life and the ecological sustainability of our cities. So and then the other two I would mention real quickly are not really books that necessarily speak to the problem as we have stated it, so much as I think help restore or helped encourage in me a a deep love and appreciation of the wilderness and the profound mystery of our world. One is Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, which, Pulitzer Prize winning novel about, her sort of encounter with the divine, as sort of a modern Walden, I think it was called. And then the other is H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, which is about her her dealing with the death of her father by taking up falconry. And it's just, and she starts digging into the history of falconry and the relationship of ancient peoples to animal familiars. And I think it's a really beautiful, um, it's a really beautiful exploration of what historian William Irwin Thompson refers to frequently as the entelechy, which is the self as animal, vegetable, and mineral. Understanding yourself as like within and defined by and emergent through all of these relationships to the non-human. And as somebody who has always had a real thing for hawks and raptors, that book was just an absolutely fantastic reading experience. My soul is up there, shrieking at me right now.
At any rate, so anything you want to say about mortality, impermanence, death, and how you hold that in ways that are helpful or inspiring?
As an integral dude, I'm a both and person, and I think I've had enough what I would call non-traditional consciousness experiences over the years, um, to to you know deeply, deeply contemplate my own mortality, and also recognize that my mortality, it begs this question, or returns to this question about uh, end of the world for whom, and when we're talking about grief, obviously it's sort of like the question of free will. It's like we know at one level that we can say that this is a deterministic cosmos and that we don't have free will. That each of us are sort of driven by the algorithms of our unconscious anatomy, uh, by the constraints of this world that we've inherited, and our sort of abilities within it. But at the other, at the street level, at the human level, we have to reckon with free will, because the courts don't work without it. That, like, as
and we do seem to have the ability to choose which environment to put ourselves in, and then the environment sort of elicits us in different ways.
Right. So, I think that there are good reasons to regard this as a question that must be addressed across multiple scales of phenomena. And the question of, okay, I'm going to grieve for my mother when she passes because I am a human being and because I will miss her. And then the other scale at which, like Terence McKenna said, nothing lasts but nothing is lost. That there is a conservation of matter and energy. And the more I zoom out, and arguably a lot of religious cosmology is an attempt to deal with this, um, in a different way than direct engagement of our mortality. That there is a different sense in which nothing ever really dies. And and I think that our given that our own construction of time and duration is very much an evolutionary product, and that we think of this is a future fossils thing, right? That we think of past, present, and future as sort of a flowing continuum. But like, it's a very different thing if you look at the river from space, and you see that it all exists at once. And people like quantum physicists like Julian Barber have said that you can't understand quantum physics without regarding all moments as co-simultaneous in a sort of a transcendental dimension to our own direct experience of it. There's copious evidence. One of my favorite episodes of Future Fossils was with Eric Wargo, who wrote a book called Time Loops, going through the enormous evidence for retrocausation, which would require the future to exist already and be acting on the present. Like premonitory dreams, and so on. But like, there's a very robust body of work in quantum physics on this. And I think basically, I think that there are reasons, there are times to grieve and mourn, and then there are times to be sort of bolstered and reassured that your sort of bracketed little moment in the great unfolding is going to come to an end, but has always been eternal in its own way. You know, that like
Yeah.
everything is eternal, even if it's not endless in its duration. What they say in the Dowd I Ching, Lao Tzu talks about uh, the sage has died before dying, so he's able to cross the battlefield without being pierced by an arrow. You know,
Exactly.
that's that like, if you really want, and this is, maybe this is, you know, pinning on a sort of, uh, but you know, I've been in this criticism conversation with the transhumanists for over a decade now, where I said, you know, like, in order to have the immortality that you want, you're going to have to merge with a technological support infrastructure that is evolving so fast that you will be subject to a constant and accelerating process of metamorphosis in order to participate in it. And therefore, your sort of egoic drive to be Ray Kurzweil or Jason Silva or whatever forever is self undermining. That like you're actually rushing directly into ego death, even though you don't realize it. And like it's just, you know, kind of a joke, really, that, you know, this Faustian thing is actually a, you know, a bait and switch that like going to yoga class to look at butts is, you know, that it's like you have this sort of, there's a kind of like landscape agency distributed skillful means going on here to get you out of your own foolishness. And like, kudos to you if you end up living a million years, you know, but you're not going to, if that's the case, you're not going to be Ray Kurzweil in 100 years. You're going to be something else, you know, something much
Yeah.
broader, and in many
Yeah.
respects
Yeah.
more precarious, more at risk, you know, because of the depth and complexity of the systems upon which you depend, you know. So it's like, you know, immortality, ha.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.